Um, Good afternoon. We really enjoyed two real talks prior to the November election, and now we look forward to this afternoon's discussion in which our two guests will discuss how the checks and balances that the Constitution provided to keep the presidents from abusing their powers have been eroded over the decades. They told me before we started that they will also attempt to explain how and why this erosion has taken place, and we'll close with some thoughts about the implications of the erosion on presidential transition and for American democracy as a whole. In a future Real Talk, our guests will make some recommendations about how to begin to rectify this situation, so stay tuned. Please welcome our guests. Dr. Jeffrey Carroll, Assistant Professor of Political Science and Chair of the Center for Data and Society at CHC. His scholarly interests are in American politics with special interest in urban affairs, social geography, and civic engagement. His speaking engagements have most recently focused on race, political culture, campaigns, and elections. And please welcome as well Dr. David Contasta, Professor of History at CHC, whose scholarly interests include both local and national history, particularly American political history, the author of over 20 books on topics that range from Chestnut Hill history to work on Lincoln and Darwin, and most recently, American war history. He is currently writing a book about the American presidency entitled American Monarchy. Please join me in welcoming with silent gestures and icons, Doctors David Contasta and Jeffrey Carroll.
Yep. The delegates to the Constitutional Convention here in Philadelphia in the hot summer of 1787 met about 10 miles down the road from Chestnut Hill College in what was then the Pennsylvania State House and only later called Independence Hall. And again, they called for more energy in the government as opposed to the very weak Articles of Confederation that preceded the Constitution. And they believed that the key to putting more energy in the government was to create the office of a chief executive, or what they call the President of the United States. And they gave to the president in Article 2 of the Constitution, believe it or not, many of the same powers that belonged then to the crowned heads of Europe. Yes, powers that then belonged to the crowned heads of Europe, including the power of pardon. We've heard about that recently. The power to veto legislation. The president is the chief initiator and custodian of foreign affairs. The president is commander-in-chief of the military. And they also created what's called a unitary executive. They debated the idea of whether or not there should be a president's council or an executive council that the president would have to approach and get approval for major decisions. And this sets up, by extension, what we call the presidential prerogative. And this was a debate that they had down at the Pennsylvania State House. Should the president have a prerogative not unlike the royal prerogative that then belonged to George III? And they were adamantly opposed to this. By the presidential prerogative, I mean the ability of presidents to issue executive orders that may or may not have anything to do with congressional legislation. Now, they thought they could, though, check these powers. They thought they could stop presidents from abusing them by making sure that the legislative branch was supreme. And if you look at the Constitution, you'll see that the Article 1 of the Constitution, which sets up the legislative branch and gives powers to it, is almost 3 times the length as Article 2, which deals with the presidency. So it's clear that they wanted the bulk of power to belong in the legislature, and virtually all the powers of the national government are listed in Article 1 and not in Article 2. So they hoped that this reality, that the legislature would be supreme, would be able to check abuses of power. And we'll get to those in just a minute. But I want to read to you some quotations from some of the delegates to the convention who were really afraid of creating the presidency. They were really afraid of executive power. So that if we have concerns about executive power now, they go back 234 years to the Constitutional Convention itself. Take Alexander Hamilton, who was one of the delegates and who wrote in the Federalist Papers. These were newspaper articles in New York newspapers to try to convince people that the Constitution should be ratified. Anyway, Hamilton writes, "There is hardly any part of the system which could have been attended with greater difficulty than the arrangement of the presidency." They wrangled about it, they wrangled about it, they wrangled about it. James Madison, who's seen as the primary architect of the Constitution, quoted what a constituent had written to him, saying that the Constitution is setting up a, quote, direct and irresistible tendency to monarchy. And then there's our friend Benjamin Franklin, who tended to be fairly optimistic. Franklin said, "The executive will always be increasing here as elsewhere till it ends in monarchy," unquote. And then as a graduate student at Johns Hopkins University in the early 1880s, Woodrow Wilson, anticipating the kind of powerful president he was going to become, perhaps, wrote this: "The president's privileges are many and substantive, so great indeed that it has pleased the fancy of some writers to parade them as exceeding those of the British crown." He's writing this in the 1880s. The checks then that would come through the legislature. And again, Madison writes, hopefully, "The legislative department derives a superiority in our government." And he goes on, "The constitutional powers being at once more extensive, it is less susceptible to precise limits," that is, the legislature. And then he turns to talk about the presidency, which I find interesting. "The executive power being more restrained within a narrow compass and being more simple in its nature, any projects of usurpation would immediately betray and defame it." Immediately betray and defame it. So he's hoping not only in public opinion, but what the legislature would do in response. And again, he goes on to say, "The legislative department alone has access to the pockets of the people." I like that. The legislative department alone has access to the pockets of the people. And here he's talking about what we call the power of the purse. Only the legislative branch can lay and collect taxes. Only the legislative branch can approve budgets. Only the legislative branch is responsible for spending, ultimately. And Madison also says, I think naively, that people would feel closer to their member of Congress than they would to the President of the United States, because they would know their member of Congress. And now we have the opposite situation. There are many people who don't even know the names of their member of Congress, but they know the name of the president, and they know what the president looks like. And they would recognize the president's voice. I'm not sure many people would recognize the voices of their members of Congress. And there's some reasons for that I think Jeffrey is going to address a little bit later on. Let's talk then about the checks that Madison hoped that the legislative branch would have over the presidency, more specifically. Congress can override a veto, a presidential veto, by a 2/3 vote. However, it's very unlikely that members of the president's party are going to go along with that. That is because of party discipline, they're going to refuse to override a veto. Now, sometimes that happens, but usually it does not. Treaties have to be ratified by a 2/3 vote in the Senate. But what the framers of the Constitution didn't anticipate is that presidents have made executive agreements with the heads of other countries and have not submitted it to the Senate, saying that it's not a treaty. And we learn in Article 1 that only Congress can declare war. The last time Congress declared war was on December the 8th, 1941, when it declared war on Japan. And yet since then, we have fought wars in Korea, in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, and in Iraq. Now, Congress tried to deal with that situation through the War Powers Act of 1973, requiring presidents to come and ask for permission to use force. But we know that Congress is always going to go along, because if a president goes to Congress and says there's a crisis and I need to use force, they're not going to call him a liar. The media is not going to call him a liar. The American people are not going to call him a liar. They're going to go along with it because there's a tendency to believe that the president knows things we don't know and that the president is going to tell the truth if he's asking for power to use force. Then there's the power of the purse. That's kind of a dead letter too. Theoretically, Congress could stop a war in its tracks by refusing to finance it, but it's not going to do that because they'll be accused of being unpatriotic. During the Cold War, they would have been accused of being soft on communism. They'd be accused of abandoning the troops in the field. And even when it comes to non-military uses, Congress is not likely to defund a project that the president wants or that is already undertaken because members of the president's party will not go along with that. Besides that, the budgetary process is very slow. And then there's impeachment. Madison breezily said in the Federalist Papers that anytime a president acts up, he can be impeached. Well, we know that's not going to happen. It's a dead letter, essentially, because members of the president's party, no matter what he does, no matter what the evidence is, are not going to convict him in the Senate. Now, Richard Nixon probably would have been convicted, but that was a different time if he hadn't resigned. There was not the political gridlock then that there is now. I'll just say a word about judicial checks very quickly. There's nothing in the Constitution about judicial review. The Supreme Court gives it to itself in 1803 in a case that I won't even get into. But the Supreme Court has been very loath to check presidents and to declare their actions to be unconstitutional because, ironically, the courts have respected what they call the separation of powers. And besides that, who's in charge of enforcing court orders? The President of the United States, because he's the chief law enforcement agent. And presidents have defied the Supreme Court. Andrew Jackson defied the Supreme Court. Abraham Lincoln defied the Supreme Court. You can say Lincoln did it for a good reason, Jackson did it for a bad reason. But the courts have been unable in many instances, in most instances, to rein in presidents, and they don't even try. Finally, I think we must see the Constitution as a remarkable document, particularly since its authors had no models to follow. There was nothing else in the world like what they wanted to create. And of course, they couldn't peer 234 years into the future and know what 2021 was going to be like. Finally, I've often said that presidential power is like fire. Fire can heat our homes, but it also can burn them down. And the trick is to give presidents enough power to govern effectively, but not allow them to abuse it. And I think we've gotten to the point at which that's become almost impossible to do. And so I want to hand the baton to Jeffrey now, who's going to explain all this and tell us why presidents are out of control in the present day.
David, thank you so much for your points.
You're very welcome.
I'd like to do that. And also in my opening points today, I want to consider the idea of checks and balances and connect it with various democratic institutions, both constitutional and extra constitutional, and try to briefly link that to some points about the idea of presidential transition. In the 21st century, it has been almost impossible to, quote, check the president. And as David noted, the idea of checks and balances is fundamental to our democracy. It's an idea that the framers employed, being heavily influenced by Montesquieu. He was a French political philosopher who argued that the separation of powers was a necessary component of liberty at large and democratic stability. So this Constitution is supposed to be our guide. It's central to this relative idea that we have rule of law in our country, but it also seems to provide little guidance to the complexity of government and politics today. The framers could not have foreseen what American society looks like in the 21st century as it wrote the Constitution. Um, Lately, the presidency has grown in terms of structure, importance, and in power over time. We can characterize the presidency in many ways, but I like to think about it in one of two ways. The president as the institutional executive, think about this person as inherent in the structure of federal government, the person that sits atop of the organizational charts. And today there are 10 million plus civil servants. There are postal workers and active duty military and contractors, grantees, and all of these domains that we didn't have before, right? Health and human services and veterans, homeland security, for example, transportation. There are 15 cabinet departments today and over 2,000 different agencies in the federal bureaucracy today. That's quite a lot of red tape, right? The House staff alone employs nearly 2,000 plus people. And to think that the President Franklin D. Roosevelt's staff in 1939 had 8 people, right? And then just tens that worked in the White House. And then to turn, it's the president as the character, okay? The person that exerts leadership, supposedly, this employing eloquent, well, at least persuasive oration, political skill. This is the person that builds coalitions. Some would even say that the president is our chief citizen, is the person that should be most reflective of the ideals of the country as a whole. Well, the 2020 presidential election was historic in many ways, but one that might be a lasting legacy here are the implications of the most recent presidential transition. Okay. True separation of powers implies that the president and the bureaucracy operates under these limits of power. Okay. It assumes that presidential action can be thwarted without consensus, and that the office is quite limited, right, in terms of the action that the president can take unilaterally. Some of those things that David was talking about as the framers intended. Now, mind you, shortly after being elected, though, Donald Trump stated, quote, "I have an Article 2 where I have the right to do whatever I want as president," quote. Now, the notion was dismissed, of course, by many, but in hindsight, to what extent had that been true over the last 4 years? And suffice it to say that the Trump administration put democratic institutions to a stress test that is rarely seen in our country's history. So, in this context, though, the presidential transition takes on another spirit. It's one that feels like an abrupt shift in the direction of government and politics as a whole. And this seems to not be what the framers intended. Their description of change from one president to the next is one more about stability and continuity rather than one of today is of disruption. Is presidential transition in the 21st century, I'm just thinking out loud, is it one that necessitates 180-degree turns? It's an about face of government and politics. So just pause for a second. Just consider how you felt after the November 2016 presidential election. Okay. Now, consider how you felt in the November 2020 presidential election. Okay. How is it that there are such strong emotions that accompany the change of just one person. So the more politically efficacious that you are, the more you're paying attention, the stronger those emotions. There are a set of conditions that we experienced lately that have made us feel the weight of presidential transition. So allow me to just briefly mention a few, all interrelated, and I'll get into a closing point. The first is political polarization, one in which we've talked about over the last couple of real talks. And there's a clear fundamental divide of attitudes towards government and politics. And this is translated into a division over issues and, in turn, our attitude to political elites, too. Lately, party identification determines if we like someone or not, both in the terms of operation of government and in society. Now, the framers set up a structure of government based on this idea of give and take, the idea that problems will be solved through process and won through compromise. Remember that? Remember compromise? They were very wary of the idea of any type of group subverting the interests of the community at large. David noted Madison in particular, very wary. Now, thinking through these issues has been just replaced with listening to the opinion of those with the largest platforms and loyalty to those factions, as they would call it, but now political party first overall. So polarization has actually pervaded every level of our society, from our Thanksgiving conversations with our families and extended families, our friends, to the workings, or lack of work, some might argue, of Congress. Okay, now this has created a very dangerous environment, right? With one in which some argue certain literacies have completely been suspended, a ripe environment to exploit misinformation, an overt attempt of those in power to purposefully dupe the public for their own individual ends. Now, we have a private media system in which broadcast media, just starting with cable television, that's long retrenched from journalistic objectivity for a long time. But the new digital media environment, as you know, has allowed us to be contributors in ways that actually has been healthy and unhealthy to civic engagement. It's healthy that we're engaged and that we interact with one another, but it becomes unhealthy, of course, when we use our platform to advance mistruths and to shame others, and as of lately, how to organize for malicious activity. Now, a plethora of research in political science shows that public digests media, traditional, social, and otherwise, not necessarily to gain awareness of an issue, to decipher meaning, to learn, but rather to reinforce our own political attitudes. So, as a society and in the aggregate, this just led to just baffling inconsistencies in comprehension of events and a great amount of cognitive dissonance. What's dangerous, of course, is that certain groups have been compelled to act on strong feelings, including lately inciting violence. And to these people, though, they believe themselves to be truth seekers and truth tellers. Okay. Now, given that there are fundamentally disparate views in society operating concurrently through the media that we're consuming, now there's a fundamental distrust in our institutions, even the most basic ones, such as elections. Okay, so history will show that support for President Trump was actually remarkably stable throughout, stable. Supporters have stood by him despite his chaotic and unpredictable administration to the end. But the administration will be known for how much it thrived on theatrics. And out of what happened in the last 4 years, I think it's the events that led to the second impeachment that may be scrutinized the most through over time. Because it is the free and fair elections part and that peaceful transition of power that are the hallmarks of democracy. And both of those notions have really been thrown into question as of lately. One that doesn't sit well with us and in the American public, who, as Americans, we believe we're the gatekeepers of democratic values, right? a large percentage of the public has not believed that the recent election has been free and fair. And also, it has to be said that given the events of January 6th, there was just no peaceful transition of power. So, to conclude with this, we have to come to grips here that we have been under a real democratic backslide, both in terms of the Constitution, but in other of our political institutions too. But and it's also not been just the United States. We've been in a grip of global erosion of democratic norms. That's been occurring for some time. So today, with transition, Joe Biden seeks to counter the Trump narrative in many ways as he can. He's labeled himself and perceived to be sensible, compassionate, science based, politically experienced. He's someone that ran on the platform of restoring order to a dysfunctional Washington. And given the breadth of the crises that we are confronted with, it will take a masterful command of the presidency, one as the executive and one in terms of character that uplifts the nation. Now, it's about this last part I have to close with. Now, it's only been a few weeks since the inauguration, but you can already see the shift in policy, but in rhetoric. Okay. As the executive, what can be more of an about face than the appointment of marginalized citizens into positions of leadership? In terms of character, what can lower the temperature and the tension in society more than employing the language of inclusion rather than political exclusion? But we have a far way to go. So in any case, I hope that these new norms that have really stressed our country is only temporary, that we can soon enter a restoration, stop democratic backslide. If so, then the focus will finally be devoted to the citizenry as a collective and the public goodwill as the framers intended, all necessary for a healthy and functional democracy. And with that, I'm really hopeful. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeffrey. We're going to open up to questions if anybody wants to either write in the chat or raise their hand. I think that our speakers, our guests would be happy to engage them. I'm sure that we have quite a few of them.
Make a comment just while we're waiting for some questions to come in. One of the assumptions that the framers, we call them the framers, I'm not sure why, I guess because they're putting it together, assumed that certain norms would be followed. They assumed that presidents of the United States would respect truth and reason and facts and would follow certain norms of polite behavior. And that's not written in the Constitution. And yet most presidents have followed those norms. They've tried to. There have been some exceptions. And we find that there's no way of forcing a president to follow these norms.
We have a question from Dennis.
Hello there. The person who was just talking, I'm sorry, I can't pronounce your name.
Jeffrey or David Contesta?
Okay, David Contesta.
Yes.
I was wondering, is there any true safety nets that we have in place that protects us from a president or a governing body that has majority control over one of the, either the House or the Senate? So that way, so even if the Senate says get someone out of here, the House can reject it, or vice versa. Is there any safety net against that?
No, I don't think so. And Jeffrey talked about this eloquently. The framers knew there would be factions, and they thought that that was good, that there would be different interests, but that there would be compromise. And I would say up to the early 1990s, although maybe there's a breakdown before that, the political parties tended to be big tents. There were liberal Republicans and conservative Republicans and moderate Republicans and liberal Democrats and conservative Democrats and moderate Democrats. And they often found that although they belonged to separate parties, they agreed on a number of issues. Now it's just total war. And so I'm not sure this is what you're getting at, Dennis, but if the president's party controls either house, there's not going to be an effective check and balance on this person. It's just not going to happen.
Thanks, David.
Thank you very much. That answered my question.
You're welcome.
I was going to ask, and it's about 2 years ago, let's say, when Bill Barr came in, and we knew that he had written about wanting to increase or extend presidential power. I think that's something he's felt since the Bush administration. What does anybody know what his reasons were for feeling that we needed to increase the power of the presidency?
Jeffrey, do you want to take that one?
I think that the idea was what David alluded to was the presidential prerogative,
Mhm.
and that over time, and what I'm guessing is that there has been a real debate among legal scholars to just exactly how much power the president can have, and he takes the position that under certain conditions, and certainly under the conditions that President Trump was operating in, that presidential prerogative should be invoked, as particularly under those things that were perceived to be crises. And the framers did said that they were wary. They were certainly wanted to give the president a power, but over time, how it got interpreted was that the office would need to expand just in terms of dealing with crises. And I think that's what Bill Barr was getting at.
I'd like to just say a few words about Theodore Roosevelt here. He's one of the culprits. He issued 1,080 executive orders during his presidency. And he said, so long as it's not specifically against the Constitution, I have the right to do it. And during the anthracite strike of 1902, he says the people were not made for the Constitution. The Constitution was made for the people. And Roosevelt, like most presidents who came after him, was very clever in using the most recent media. Roosevelt was very clever in using photography and using very early crude movies. And we get into the 1930s with radio, later on with television, and then, of course, with social media. And presidents recently have become celebrities. I know that Donald Trump was a reality television star, but we've had a number of persons who've been able to use the media in order to present themselves as celebrities. And I would count in this John F. Kennedy and Ronald Reagan, and certainly President Trump. And I don't know how Congress then can compete with someone whose picture is all over the place, who's on television all the time. And this goes back much earlier with newsreels in the movie theaters. So no wonder the president can command this kind of authority, and no one really can compete with it. I think it's extremely dangerous. If we're back in the 19th century, when the president is going to be filtered through newspapers, the presidents simply don't have that kind of standing and stature.
Michelle Presnell has had her hand up for a little while. So Michelle, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I don't know how to take my hand down, so
I
let's.
keep that.
Okay. And this is for either of you, and I hope this isn't too tangential, but can you speak a little bit to Dr. Contasta? You had that quote from President Trump earlier about, I'm the president, I can do whatever I want. And can you speak a little bit about the kind of American idea of freedom, and freedom being sort of bound up in this I can do what I want kind of thought, if you could speak to that at all.
Well, I think Jeffrey's the one who talked about President Trump saying that Article 2 let him do anything he wanted to do. And I think that's a real problem. How do you stop a president? you take a president to court? What if the president ignores what the court has to say? What if you take the president to Congress and try to impeach and remove him from office? That's not going to work either. The Congress is not going to use the power of purse against the president. There seems to be no way to stop a president. So in some ways, when President Trump said, I can do anything I want, he's telling the truth. In effect, he can do anything that he wants. And Jeffrey and I had a discussion on the phone a couple of days ago, which is kind of relevant, I think. I think the American people do want a king or a royal presence. And this goes all the way back to the very beginning. George Washington's birthday replaced the king's birthday. In colonial times, people were used to celebrating the king's birthday. And Washington was faulted for creating a Republican court here in Philadelphia in his house at 6th and Market, if I have that right. I think that's where the archaeological remains of that are. And he had liveried servants wearing white wigs and shoes with silver buckles and silk stockings and knee breeches and so forth. And he would bow stiffly, and he called Martha Washington Lady Washington, and he went through the streets of Philadelphia in a fine coach pulled by 6 horses with his coat of arms on the side. Now, Jefferson reverses a lot of that, but we still have this pomp and circumstance surrounding the president with red carpets and trumpets and bands playing Hail to the Chief. And some presidents really liked that. Nixon loved that. He loved for the Marine Band to play that. And he'd sail up and down the Potomac in the evenings. Prime ministers in other countries don't get that kind of treatment. Think of 10 Downing Street as opposed to the White House. And we have a system, interestingly enough, where the president is both head of state. He's the chief ceremonial officer. He's also head of government. I think there is a desire, and maybe it's not bad, for people to see the president as almost not entirely human, as a kind of a superhuman creature. I'll say just one more thing about Washington. There's the apotheosis of Washington that's making someone in a godlike figure. And there are all these lithographs of showing Washington in heaven dressed up like a Greek god. And if you go to the Capitol building and look up in the rotunda, there's the apotheosis of Washington there. He's sitting there like a Greek god, and there are biblical figures all around him. So maybe it's important to exalt the presidency, but I think it can be dangerous. And I think the framers would be utterly appalled.
David, I wanted to take a different turn on that question, though. I think that, thinking out loud, that Americans' notions of discussing political liberty are just absolutely not nuanced at all. Just the intentions of how liberty as a political ideal got put into our system. Mind you, we were made a transition away from monarchy into setting up the system that was inherent with these freedoms. We practically plagiarized, right, from John Locke. Life, liberty, and
property.
Well, we crossed out pursuit of happiness because it was Locke who said life, liberty, and property. It was a fundamental freedom to pursue our interests for a select few to hold property on the condition that we don't hurt other people. So this is where that just idea of I could do whatever we want. Of course, that we amended the Constitution to provide for certain freedoms that became enumerated and would translate that's just over time. But what happens when the freedoms, right, inherently does harm the collective good, right? So we always have that tension that's at play, and that's really difficult to talk about, because if you take that a step further, that collective good thing happens to do about political equality, and to try to think about the intersection of freedom and liberty and equality, it's these two really big concepts that end up being at tension with one another, right?
Yes.
And so I think that it's just become very difficult. So Michelle, I guess I would agree that it's just the notion of what constitutes freedom as an ideal. It has become very amorphous, and maybe one that we really should discuss more, because it's inherent just in our values as Americans, right?
Yeah, Michelle, I agree. A lot of people say, I'm going to do what I want by God, and no one's going to tell me what to do. The government's not going to tell me what to do. This is good, and yet it's bad. And it's an argument that's gone back and forth on the federal level. Herbert Hoover says during the Great Depression, you should be a rugged individual and stand up for yourself and not become a welfare bum and expect the government to bail you out. And then FDR comes in and does something very different. And he's accused of getting rid of people's freedoms and eroding the freedoms. And that's not a bad argument, what the balance should be. But there doesn't seem to be any willingness or ability to compromise, as there has been at other times in our history. And I've been reading this book called Caste, which is really horrifying and scary. It's interesting that the framers of the Constitution really didn't believe that all people were created equal, regardless of what Thomas Jefferson had to say. For heaven's sakes, a number of them were slaveholders. In fact, the word democracy does not occur in the Constitution anywhere. People think it does, but it doesn't. The word republic doesn't appear in the Constitution anywhere, although the Constitution is supposed to guarantee the states a republican form of government. Now, I'm not saying that's an excuse. Some people are saying, well, we're not supposed to have a democracy. We've evolved in that direction. It's an evolving system. But I do think that we're at a crisis, as Jeffrey says. There is really no way to control an out of control president. No way. No how. And even the voters can't seem to do it. And whether Jeffrey was going to talk about this or not, the Electoral College has defeated democracy again and again. And 5 times in US history, the president who won the majority of the popular votes lost the presidency. And that's always led to a sense of illegitimacy. The president is illegitimate. That person shouldn't be president of the United States. And actually, it was set up at the Constitutional Convention because the 5 southern states did not want popular vote, because they was afraid that the northern states would become more populous and they might be able to interfere with slavery at some point. And the closest we've ever come to getting rid of it was 1969, 1970, and Strom Thurmond and the southern states blocked it because they wanted to have that as a way of standing in the way of a popular sentiment to bring about a civil rights revolution. So we also have a problem of voter suppression. One way that the voters can check the president is by going to the polls. But if their votes are suppressed, if there are attempts to keep them from voting by hiding precincts and moving them all over the place and not putting up mail-in boxes where they might be convenient and coming up with voter ID and so forth. One of the strengths of our system is federalism, but we have 50 different voting systems essentially in this country, and it's very difficult to control what the states are going to do. And now they're having all these kind of investigations about the election and how it was rigged and what they can do to stop that from happening again. It's probably going to result in voter suppression. So even the voters don't have a check on the president in many cases.
We have several comments in the chat. One of them speaks to that last point, that, even though there was a violent transition of power in January, in the end, the election did prevail and Trump is no longer in office. Maybe one of you would want to speak to that. And there were some questions about, is our executive orders in some way an abuse of power? And also, would you really say that the power of the purse is dead when, or do you mean it is when the both, like often Congress is checking the president in terms of not allowing for certain expenditures. I think that was Jackie Reich's comment. She was citing, Obama didn't get many of his things through a Republican Congress.
I'll just mention one thing. President Trump wanted to build a wall. He couldn't get the money, so he takes it from the Pentagon. He takes it from military expenditures. How do you stop a renegade president from acting like that? I don't think that there's any good way. And so far as, yes, Biden became president, but my God, by the skin of his teeth. And there are still millions of people in this country who will not admit that he won the election and that he's president of the United States, which is extraordinarily dangerous. Jeffrey?
In terms of power of the purse, I suppose that it's not necessarily dead because there's elements of using the budgetary politics to thwart. But there are certain, let's just say that there are certain powers, though, that it could be circumvented, and even ones that are really specifically enumerated in the Constitution. I'm thinking about around war. Where that is in Article 1 about war and declaring war, giving that as a power of Congress and then funding it. The framers were really clear on that being congressional power, but how it's been interpreted over time to be now a power of the presidency, right? That this is the commander of chief. And even notwithstanding the act of Congress going to declare war, the country still moves towards military action anyway. But in turn, my point is that, and funds it. It happens concurrently. So I guess that's a really good question. It's not dead per se, but there are certainly a lot of conditions that are really concerning about how that can be circumvented.
Yeah, and the framers were really frightened about the war power because they knew these monarchs in Europe were constantly dragging their people into unnecessary wars. And they did not want the president of the United States to be able to do that. And yet this has occurred. Congress wasn't able to stop the Vietnam War, even though there was more and more and more opposition to it. And presidents lied about it. The Pentagon Papers revealed that 5 presidents lied about what was going on in Vietnam and why we had to be there. I think there's another question up here in the corner. I don't know.
Yeah, Kaya Kraft has her hand up.
Yeah, it's Kaya. So you both mentioned that the presidency has expanded its power, and this is something that we can see of late, especially. However, everyone compares it to President Trump, yet President Trump signed only 24 executive orders in his first 100 days, while President Biden has made 34 executive orders in roughly his first 40 days. So since there are so many different changes and in the length of time, would you say that the power is expanding even more recently?
Well, I think it's because of the gridlock in Congress, and presidents have found that they can't get Congress to pass legislation, so they resort to presidential orders. And it's not all that effective because, as we see, the next president can come in and undo all of those executive orders. But the power of the presidency and the abuse of presidential power has been mounting for a long time. In my book, I'm saying that President Trump, in many ways, is the culmination of a process from the last century at least, and maybe even going back before that. And that's one of the things I'm trying to explain in my book as to why and how this has occurred. And part of it's what Jeffrey has talked about. The country has become huge. Congress passes regulatory legislation. They can't enforce them. They have to depend upon the president to do that. The United States was not a world power in 1787. Anybody who said that would have been laughed at that point. We don't really become a great world power until around 1900. And then the president, with commander-in-chief, becomes extraordinarily powerful. So one of the things I did in a chapter, it's about Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Jackson. You can say they both abused power. You can say Lincoln did it for a good reason, And Jackson did it for a bad reason. That's what I meant about presidential power being like fire. And progressives or liberals or whatever you want to call them, reformers, have tended to exalt presidential power. They've tended to believe that that's necessary to bring about reform. Among their heroes are Theodore Roosevelt, who probably would be a Democrat rather than a Republican these days, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, Lyndon Johnson. And so that I think bears about what I'm trying to say. Sometimes it's been considered to be good and sometimes it's been considered to be bad. And maybe to bring about a reform agenda, you do need to have a powerful president who can command the media and turn the White House into a bully pulpit. That was Theodore Roosevelt. He'd like to say bully. And Roosevelt, by the way, had the White House guards dressed in uniforms as if they were palace guards with gold braid. We know that Nixon does that later on, and it's Roosevelt who completely remodels the White House in the colonial revival style and makes it look like almost a palatial residence. Should the president live in a place like that? I don't know. Go ahead.
I really like this question because the discussion of executive orders is actually extremely complicated and nuanced.
Right.
And what some folks in political science have conveyed is that we have to put the president in terms of the context of the orders in which and why there is an aggregation of the orders at a particular time. Okay, so that all that means is to say, what are the conditions of why there's a lot of executive orders or little amount of executive orders? And it's really interesting to compare a president at a certain time, like President Trump being in January through March 2017, compared to President Biden January through March of 2021. And why is it that Biden has so many? And what they're finding is that some has to do about putting these orders into different categories. So, for example, one type of executive order is reversing agenda.
Right.
You can actually make an executive order to reverse the agenda of a previous president, which presidents always do. So how many of those orders have linked to that? And how many of the orders are there to expedite regulatory matters or pretty much almost like rulemaking, making law that needs to happen? And some of that, let's say in times of crisis like today, that can be a part of it. So I say that I just find that fascinating, when you compare the orders at presidencies, but it happens under the caveat, though, that we can't just compare the number. We also have to put side by side of exactly what those conditions are. But underlying this, though, I had an exchange with a colleague this morning. Those ramp up of the executive orders and regulatory parts has happened over time because of the gridlock, because it essentially is the president trying to set agenda that it just can't wait for Congress to be expedient. And now, today, with the crisis that we have, it's almost like using the presidential power to make things move.
And some of them are really mundane. Some of them are just orders to various parts of the bureaucracy, as Jeffrey says, as to how to carry out a policy. And they're rather benign. So there are different categories. And because he's head of the entire executive branch, he has to do that, or she has to do that from time to time.
Some of them, I think the majority of them are. And then the ones that we hear about that filter up and bubble through the debate in the public are the ones that seem to be earth-shaking, right? The ones such as the travel bans, for example, of the last 4 years are examples of executive orders that it's one executive order, but what the impact of having not just an American impact, a global impact with the strike of a pen.
We have a question from Rita Brazillo about would term limits for Congress help gridlock? Or do you want to say anything else about ways to kind of help that gridlock that seems to be one of the problems?
It might. On the other hand, you want people with some institutional memory, you want people with some experience. So you wouldn't want to limit it too drastically, but maybe to some degree. And there were no limits on presidential terms until after Franklin Roosevelt had 4 terms. And then in 1951, presidents are limited to 2 terms, thank God. So it would be a delicate balance. Governorships are often limited. I don't know that, Jeffrey, do you know that if any state legislative terms are limited in length?
Oh, certainly. Certainly, of the state legislatures. I think that, Rita, this is a great question because it's, I think a lot of the debate happens to be about is focused on the Senate.
Right.
As a lot of folks are debating of whether the Senate should have term limits. And I just find it a little funny that folks say, oh, you can't do that. They've always have had these 6-year terms have always been around. Well, actually, there was a long time that we didn't even elect our senators. That was actually, the Senate was designed by the framers, absolutely the most undemocratic institution. So if we wanted to enact term limits, we actually could. And I'm an institutionalist by nature. I don't like kind of incremental changes to the structure, but it may change. It actually may. That certainly is up for debate.
It's interesting that the root word for Senate is the same for senile. They came from the same Latin root. And the framers wanted senators to be a little older and wiser. That's why they had to be 30 years old as opposed to 25 in the House. And they'd have a 6-year term, so they would have a steadier hand. So I think that's kind of interesting. That's no reason why we shouldn't have term limits, though. And once you're an incumbent, particularly in the Senate, it's really difficult to get a person out because that individual is going to be able to raise huge amounts of money. That individual is going to be able to stay in power because the constituents say, well, he or she is in important committees and can bring home all kind of money to the state. So I think it is a problem.
I have a question for you too. Do you think that if, David talked about the way that the framers had in mind a monarchy that they did not want to repeat. And so they were writing something that they thought would ward against that. If instead they had a crystal ball and they were trying to ward off a military dictatorship, do you think that a number of things would be different in terms of checks and balances of power?
Well, some people have suggested, and this is not a direct answer, that we'd be better off in a parliamentary system. And one of the reasons they didn't adopt it then is because they thought the parliament in Great Britain was corrupt and was stacked full of people who were elected from rotten boroughs, and the king was able to create peerages and so forth to get what he wanted. So modern parliamentary democracy really hadn't arisen at that point. I think that goes back to the models that they had before them. They didn't have any models before them. And they looked at the Roman Republic, they looked at Greek democracies, they read Locke, they read Montesquieu. I think they did a pretty good job depending on what they had. If we had a parliamentary system, of course, the president's party could depose him, or there could be a vote of no confidence. And this has happened in the UK fairly recent. We have a very rigid system. Jeffrey and I were talking about that. The president is in there generally for 4 years and often for 8. There's not much that can be done about it. Even the 25th Amendment seems to be a dead letter, Article 5 of the 25th Amendment, which was put in there as a result of the Kennedy assassination. What if a president is shot and is comatose and can't function? But I guess a more delicate question is, what if the president becomes mentally ill? What if the president can't function? The cabinet, which is made up of members of the president's party, is not going to invoke the 25th Amendment. That's another dead letter. I think the president would have to be in a coma and totally unconscious. And this is not a joke. Woodrow Wilson was president during his last 18 months of office after he had a devastating stroke and was really unable to function as president. His wife did, for all intents and purposes. She would receive messages from the Congress and then write answers back to them. So I'm not sure they would have created something else. It's amazing they did it in 4 months downtown.
Kayla, you know what is interesting is that there is a little bit of evidence of what could have been in the 1789 Constitution, about what could have been in Article 2, because the various states at that point, you know, operating in the Articles of Confederation, they had their own state constitutions.
They did, yeah.
So there were some of those constitutions that provided the executive, the governors, with a fair amount of power, and the other ones that were weak. And get this, there were some other ones that were really super democratic for the time, not like
Pennsylvania's first constitution was
Oh,
extraordinary.
Pennsylvania's first constitution, historically, James Madison himself was perplexed at how democratic that it was. And then, but these are some of the debates that they had when they were meeting for those 4 months. And then it just goes to show about what the give and take ended up being, that the constitutions of a lot of 1789 didn't really be democratic, certainly wasn't going to push to where the Pennsylvanians, and we're really driven by our Quaker society and our openness and communality, you know, that really drove that. But certainly just kind of away from strong executives, like, oh, wait, hold on, there's something, you know, that's going on here. It's funny though that at the end of the day, it's true. It's that it's interesting that it got put into a person, you know, because the executive power was put into a person, like, and we named them, we enumerated it: governor, president, and just by doing that alone gives a little bit of kind of like monarchy kind of feeling, because, you know, we actually put those kind of powers into.
Well, more governor than president. President simply means a person who presides. That's what it means, a person who presides over the government, whereas governor has more of a sense of authority.
Oh, I love that question. Thanks, Kaylee. I can go on that for ever. Yeah.
We have several more questions. Do you guys have time for just a couple more?
Yeah.
I have to teach at 4:00, but otherwise.
I do too, but let it roll. Yeah.
So a couple more. We'll end in a couple minutes, but there was a question about Supreme Court justice term limits. We haven't really talked about the court, and then Jackie Reich is pointing out that, you know, even within Pennsylvania, there was had become the tyranny of the majority against minorities, and, you know, especially ironically Quakers, right? There was also much earlier a question from Ian Sharp that he wanted to know about ideas about kind of containing or reversing some of the deepest conspiracy QAnon thinking right now that seems to be particularly corrosive and convincing people that, you know, there's nothing to believe in here in terms of what's left of our government and democracy.
I'll take the Supreme Court and then turn it over to Jeffrey.
Getting most
He
of
might
the
have
questions.
something to say about that. The reason that they have life terms is so they won't be influenced by politics. They can be impeached, by the way, so that they serve for life or good behavior. If Supreme Court terms are maybe 18 years or 12 years or something, it seems to me there could be a lot of politicking involved, but there is anyway, right, when it comes to choosing members of the court. And it's an aristocratic body too. It's not democratic, supposedly. The Senate wasn't either. They thought that there should be a democratic element, an aristocratic element, and a monarchical element. I think they were influenced by Aristotle in that sense. So anyway, Jeffrey, what do you think about the court?
The court is purposefully, a Supreme Court, meant to just provide that stability that's just over time. And it was clear about that wanting that to be independent of those of turnover that's over time. So it's the one that was actually by design not supposed to be any part of democratic institution. It was a gateway that we would have representatives, and the representatives would act on the behalf of the public, who would then put their hands into then appointing the best people that would serve in the judiciary and judicial capacity, and at the highest level, the Supreme Court. And it needed the stability over time because it was supposed to be an apolitical institution by design, just for it to be apolitical. So it's just very interesting that it's gotten thrown into the debate as of recently, because it's in of itself a debate of whether the Supreme Court's a political institution.
It didn't have that much power to begin with. It's John Marshall who asserts all these powers for the court. So it's evolved too in some interesting kinds of ways. What were some of the other questions, Keely?
We had the question about the QAnon.
Yeah, the QAnon
QAnon.
question. Mhm.
Well, Americans have loved conspiracies forever and ever. And maybe that's true of other countries too. When there was this whole conspiracy in the 50s that the federal government was full of communists and that there were communists behind every tree and under every rock and so forth. And some people went to their graves swearing that McCarthy had been right. They were never willing to admit that he was wrong and was a menace and so forth. What's happened now, I think, is that the cable media and social media, which we need to talk about too, has exacerbated tendencies towards conspiracy. And the reason people believe in them is because the world is complex and scary. And this is a way of simplifying the world, of having simple answers about things. Jeffrey and I have talked about how, and more when I was growing up than when Jeffrey was, but there were only 3 television networks when I was growing up. And then they put PBS in, and there were 4 television networks. And there was a half-hour news. And because the commercial stations depended on sponsors, they didn't dare give right-wing news or left-wing news. They would tend to give news that was down the middle. It tended to be relatively factual because they would lose sponsors if they did the kinds of things that some of these cable television stations do now. And then, of course, Jeffrey did talk about social media. It's not considered to be a publisher, and therefore they can't be sued for libel. And that's in the 1983 law. I think it's Article 230 in that, which exempts them from the kinds of rules that publishers have to abide by. And then because of the algorithms in social media, they're going to feed you stuff that they think you're going to believe already. And it's really dangerous. And I don't know how we're going to deal with it ultimately. There's freedom of speech on the one hand, but then there's spreading of lies on the other. And when the internet came out, people said, oh, this is wonderful. We have all these opinions now. And people don't have to depend upon canned news. They can come up with their own news. I think it's a real curse.
I guess, Ian's question was, is it possible to kind of manage that conspiracy theory in any way? I was listening to something yesterday that was interviewing people who are now running interventions. There are families who feel like they have lost their family members.
You have to deprogram.
Yes. And then there are people who will come and do interventions. Mostly they are people who used to believe in those theories and now are kind of outside that world. But as they themselves pointed out, this is it's not possible to do this on a large scale. So what is possible for, a kind of public campaign?
Right. They're not unlike religious cults. And Jeffrey talked about cognitive dissonance. If you've held tenaciously to a belief for a long period of time, you're going to fight admitting that it's wrong because you've made dozens and maybe even hundreds and even thousands of decisions based on this belief. And then all at once you're supposed to say, oh, I said all those things and did all those things and made all those decisions based on a falsehood. That's a terrible threat, and people aren't going to do that.
It's this, the emergence of QAnon is such a complicated, perfect storm of the ugliest of our political institutions being put into a cauldron. Okay, it is mistruths, misinformation, plus political polarization of the extreme variety, plus you need digital social media, and there's another element here that is about racial politics, about the ugliest racial politics that has to be discussed here. And that when you put all that together in a set of folks that feel that their country has been taken from them and aggrieved, right? And the measures of what to do with that, I have to tell you one part of where I was blindsided by it. They were able to actually count the number of people that moved off of traditional social media platforms to the underground, to those that went into the dark web. And the federal government started following the amount of people that got put to these alternative platforms. The scale was something that I could not have ever perceived. In the events when from the week right after January 6th to the point where people were moving off of these extremist groups were moving off of Facebook, those that were going into the dark web, into places like Parler and other places, they estimate to be between 1.5 to 2 million people. Now, for me, when I had discussed this before, I always discussed this in a way that was the fringe politics group of a few thousand. But 1.5 to 2 million people, not to say that they were all engaged in violence, insurrection, etc., but the amount of people in those groups that were driven underground to be 1.5 and 2 million people is a scale I could not have ever foreseen. And I hate to give what can we do? What we know is that education, civics, liberal arts education, those things that are just fundamental to democracies and what you should know is the way to combat that. And it doesn't happen over a fell swoop. It happens over a lengthy period of time. And I think that one can argue is the unraveling of civics education over time has created for some of these conditions like that.
Jeffrey and I have talked about this. I have to spend several weeks in the basic American history course talking to my students about the Constitution, about the checks and balances, about how the government's supposed to work. They don't know. They come out of high school, many of them, not knowing these things, and that's a real concern.
It undermines their sense that it's their government too, right? And then there's that sense of disenfranchisement. I think that we're going to wrap up, except I want to say to everyone in the chat who maybe we didn't get to, or maybe I didn't completely, relay your question faithfully. I'm going to save the chat and send to both of the speakers, and we'll have that and a recording. They can get back to you, or if there are professors who would like a copy of the chat, I will see if I can send that to you so that you can continue these conversations in class too. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. It was really wonderful. We look forward to another one this semester.
Thank you for moderating, Keely. You did a great job as usual.
Thanks so much, everyone. Take care.
Thanks for coming, everyone.